This week on Quadriga, Syrian crisis. Who is pulling the strings? Two deadly bombings in the Turkish border town of Reyhanli have sent tensions between Ankara and Damascus soaring. The town is a hub for Syrian refugees and rebels. The Turkish Prime Minister blames President Bashar al-Assad for instigating the attacks. Many Turks fear being sucked into a full-scale conflict because of Erdogan's Syria policy. Their neighbor has already become a battleground for the competing interests of many different factions and states. Your host today, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. More than 70,000 people have already been killed and more than 1 million people displaced due to the Syrian conflict, which began since the uprisings in March 2011. And now the conflict threatens to spread and escalate beyond Syrian borders. How can we put an end to this? How can Western allies put an end to this conflict once and for all? That's what I want to talk about on today's show, together with my three experts. Welcome to Fawaz Tello, who is part of Syria's secular opposition movement. He has been living in exile in Germany since 2012. From 2001 to 2006, he was imprisoned by the Assad regime. Günter Seufert worked as an author and journalist in Turkey for several years before joining the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. He is an expert on Turkish domestic and foreign policy. And Robert Reed is the bureau chief for the Associated Press in Germany. Previously, he served as the AP's Middle East editor, where he directed the AP's coverage of the Arab Spring. Welcome to you all. Fawaz Tello, more than 50 people have been killed due to the car bombing in Reyhanli, in the Turkish town of Reyhanli. Do you think this is a payback on the part of the Assad regime due to Erdogan's and Turkey's support for the Syrian opposition?
I think it has two sides. It's a message by Assad regime through this group, which have been disclosed by the Turkish government that it had very close ties with the Assad regime, and they did it as the government, Turkish government is saying, to have to let this dispute inside that Turkey keep going on. Why the Turkey government is involved in what's happening. And I think it has another aspect, which also we have to take into consideration, that the Assad regime, as much as it's been in the corner, as much he want to involve more elements in that conflict, to push the Iranian, for example, and to give the excuse for the Iranian, for example, to be more involved inside this, support him in Syria. It means he need an excuse. Maybe this kind of excuse could be that the Turkish direct involvement, which is not exist till now in this conflict.
Günter Seufert, Turkish security officials have already captured some suspects, and they were all supposedly Turkish citizens. Erdogan and the Turkish government call them agents of Assad. What do they mean by that?
Naturally, he means that they acted in order of the regime, but what we see today is not the final picture, I think. The people who have been arrested are, one is a Syrian, and a lot of them are criminals without any political agenda in the past, and therefore it's not a very convincing picture yet. I think for Turkey it's important that it faces for the first time real Near East terrorism. Turkey had 30 years war with the PKK, but the PKK never acted in that way. She always limited herself because due to the stakes she has in Europe, she has in the international politics.
The PKK being the Kurdish terrorist organization.
The Kurdish organization. But now we have actors in Turkey, or bombers in Turkey, who have not taken any thought about what Europeans think or how Europeans act. It's a very new dimension.
And Robert Reed, it's a new dimension, says Günter Seufert. And indeed, this attack in the Turkish town of Reyhanli also has ramifications and is of significance to Turkish Western allies, no? Because Turkey is, after all, a NATO member.
Yes, it does. And actually, as an American, I find it curious or interesting to see another group of people discovering what the downside of Middle East involvement can be. My reaction to that, in effect, is welcome to the club. I think it's going to put pressure on the administration to appear to be doing something or moving in some direction in Syria, but I don't think it's reached the level yet of prompting the Obama administration into anything like a significant escalation of whatever involvement they've been in now for the course of the last 2 years.
And Faustello, how do you think Turkey will respond to this?
I think Turkey, since 2 years, is have a book and write down these notes. It's a cult. It has to be paid one of these days. But Turkey can't go further with a very big response and reaction without the support of its allies, especially the NATO allies. And the NATO and the Americans especially is not giving Turkey that chance. They have tried several times in the last 2 years to push the NATO to have an action, but they are not responding for that. So Turkey can't go with a very huge reaction without that support, because it's just it will open another huge dimension for the conflict in Syria. But it will be paid one of these days, and I think it will not take so long, because everything is going rapidly in that conflict.
And Günther Seufer, Turkey has already been an active player, if you will, in the Syrian conflict. For a while, it has taken more than 300,000 refugees in from Syria. Do you fear that this attack will lead Turkish citizens to turn against those Syrian refugees living within Turkish borders?
I think this happened again and already, and it happened before the blast, because we had what we heard from Reyhanli, that there was a serious competition between established Turkish merchants who earned a lot of profit from the help international organizations did to Syria, into Syria. And we saw that there was now a competing businesses set up by the Syrians itself, and therefore we had these rising tensions already in Reyhanli between Sunni people from Reyhanli and between Sunni refugees. But what I wanted to say about Turkey's response, I think first we have to see that Erdogan is a very delicate situation. We have seen Israel a week ago immediately striking into Damascus, and now Erdogan, he declared immediately that Assad is responsible, but Turkey did not act. And therefore, the whole rhetoric of Turkey as a decisive power in the Middle East has broken down. And on a wider level, we have to say that Turkey is, unfortunately, I think, relatively isolated, because Turkey is the only country in the region and in the international arena who says it was Syria, it was Assad behind. No other country did say it until today. Turkey is the only country who works for a buffer zone. Turkey is the only country until now in the West that is still cooperating with al-Nusra front group close to Al-Qaeda, despite the pressure of the Europeans and of the Obama administration. And Turkey was the only country that immediately and very harsh rejected the idea of having a conference including the regime, sitting on the table with Assad. And therefore, the Turkish government is in a very, very delicate position.
It's a delicate position indeed, Robert Reed. Erdogan, do you think that Prime Minister Erdogan has miscalculated perhaps Turkey's strength and influence in the Middle East?
I think that he miscalculated, if nothing else, early on the way that events were going to unfold. Remember the context of the uprising in Syria. We'd had uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Libya. And in most cases, these had led to the relatively rapid collapse of regimes that before these uprisings began were seen as pretty solid. And I think when the uprisings began in Syria and began to really spread, that a lot of people miscalculated, and they thought that Assad would be simply the latest one to seek asylum somewhere or to move out. And I think they grossly underestimated the dedication of the Assad regime to do whatever is necessary to hold on to power. In that sense, I think that started a whole chain of miscalculations that have continued down to this day.
And indeed, Faustello, Erdogan's approach vis-à-vis Syria is already and is also being criticized within Turkey. Many people are blaming him for positioning himself so early and so adamantly against Assad. Do you think that criticism is valid?
Actually, it's became part of the Turkish domestic political games. Yani, it has been used by the secular. Everybody is secular in Turkey, but let's define between Erdogan is secular, but the national secular movement and Erdogan have been used by those people who have declared their support, and this is very, very strange, by the way, like support to Bashar Assad as a secular regime in the area. So I think that even the sectarian dimension is taking place now in Turkey, because we know that this national secular movement based with some ethnic group in Turkey. So also it's having this dimension. I have just something about what the American administration attitude, because as part of my activity in Syria before I left, I have very close and relationship with the American and the European for 4 years from now. The American was, like the European, was expecting that Bashar Assad will not be collapsed so quickly. They expect that Bashar Assad will be the revolution will not be able to continue for that far. So they were not in hurry to do anything. They are just waiting for what's happening. And I think what's happening, they expect that at last the people will accept, and maybe Bashar Assad will make some concessions and it will be over by that point. But what's happening was totally different. What's happening was this. Actually, it's a big fail for the think tanker, especially in United States, about expecting what's going to happen in Syria.
And Günther Seufert, it is a very 100% turnaround, if you will, on the part of Erdogan's attitude towards Assad. It's hard to fathom these days, but it wasn't too long ago that both vacationed together, that Prime Minister Erdogan called Assad his brother, his friend and brother. And he's receiving a lot of criticism now for that within Turkey. How do you explain this 100% turnaround on the part of Erdogan?
I think it is exactly connected to each other. I think for the new foreign policy of Ahmet Davutoğlu, the foreign minister of Turkey, the role he envisioned for Turkey as a central power in the Middle East, in this vision, Syria played a central role, because Syria is the only Arab neighbor of Turkey. In Iraq, we have the Kurdish regional government. And Syria, as a middle-sized state, together with the small states of Jordan and Lebanon, was seen as the first step, in a way, as the first region to be economically and politically bound to Turkey. And therefore, Turkey wanted to establish itself as a regional power by binding these countries together at itself, economically integrating it economically and integrating it politically. And we have seen these high-level councils, we have seen free trade agreements, we have seen visa liberalization between all these countries, and there was talk of Erdogan to replace the European Schengen free visa travel zone with the Schengen, with the Damascus free visa travel zone. And his Minister of Industry, Zafer Caliangil, he talked about creating a zone of prosperity and stability in the Middle East, including Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria and Jordan, the Levant. And therefore, I think, and it was a part of this vision, and it was also a policy which from which Turkey gained a lot, because we know there had been the quarrel about the waters of the Euphrates. There had been the quarrel of to whom belongs Hatay, the Sanjak of Alexandret. And there had been the differences between the PKK. And all these questions had been solved by, in a way, coming to terms with Syria. And because there was so much at stake, Turkey didn't want to lose its influence in Syria when the uprising began. And as it was not able to convince Assad to step down, it immediately threw its support behind the opposition, because that would be the new way, really, to have its grip, to hold its grip on Syria. And that, I think, that was the reason why the Turks, more than others, miscalculated it, because they wanted so much.
And Robert Reed, a lot of people are saying that this attack in Reyhanli in Turkey adds a new quality, if you will, to the Syrian conflict, because now the conflict escalates and spreads into other countries as well. Do you think that is what Assad wants? Do you think that is what Assad's aim is in the first place?
No, I think he's like a guard dog that barks when a stranger approaches. I'm not sure that he wants to sustain, any kind of long-term cross-border involvement. But every now and then, we assume it's the Syrian regime has done things to remind people that there are regional risks. Look at the fighting in Tripoli, Lebanon. Look at incidents that have happened elsewhere in Lebanon. I think the Jordanians are quite afraid that someday they're going to suffer from something like this. So I'm not sure yet it signals a decision to push the conflict outside the region. It's a reminder to people that this is a possibility.
And the possibility very much exists not only in Turkey and beyond, because there are a lot of countries that have divergent interests invested in the Syrian conflict. Let's have a look.
U.S. President Barack Obama faces a dreadful dilemma in Syria. Washington has acknowledged evidence of the regime's use of chemical weapons, Obama's previously stated red line for intervention. But if the Syrian leader is ousted, he could be replaced by Muslim radicals. Another result could be Syria as an unstable or failed state. Until now, Iran and, more importantly, Russia have been determined to keep their only real ally in the Middle East from being toppled. But Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia has been arming Syria's rebel opposition and aims to use the war in Syria to weaken the strength of Shiite Iran in the region. Israel also wants to curb Iran's influence. Its recent airstrike on Damascus was an attempt to disrupt the arms supply from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah. Israel is determined to enforce its own red line here.
Well, Robert Reed, as we just saw, a lot of countries who have a stake in this conflict. Let's start with the United States. A lot of people are looking towards Washington for a solution to this conflict. Yet President Obama is rather hesitant, and a lot of people are saying that the supposed failure on the part of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq is part of the reason, if not even the reason, why Obama is hesitant to go into Syria. Would you agree?
Yes, and regardless of how you define, the legacy of the U.S. military role in those two countries, there's really, I don't sense any support in the United States for a major military operation outside the U.S. borders at this time. The Bush administration spent the political capital of 4 administrations, and this is a debt that's a long way from being paid. There's, yes, they're the McCains, and yes, they're the Lindsey Grahams, and they're the usual cast of characters who will always call for something like this, but really, I think they're in the minority. So Obama faces this. Obama faces the problem that if he intervenes in Syria, that will suck the air out of the administration for the rest of its time in office. There'll be nothing of his domestic agenda and legacy that he'll be able to get through. It'll cost him every bit of political capital he's got to finance and support a war in Syria.
And Fawaz Tello, John Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, has had meetings with his counterpart Lavrov as well as President Putin in Russia, and both basically propose an international conference which is supposed to be held in June to solve this conflict, or at least bring the players together at the table. As a Syrian, are you hopeful that this meeting will produce anything of substance?
No, I want to comment about this and combine the two, the negotiations and what there is a big illusion is being spread in the West, among the European and the American, like that referendum which have been take place in the United States before maybe 1 week. They are asking a question that, are you agree for the American to interfere in Syria? Of course, 66% of the Americans said no. If I was American, I would say no also. This is not the question. The people are not asking for the American. You can't compare to interfere like Iraq and Afghanistan. The problem there that the American is having a very huge pressure among its allies, like the Turkeys and Saudis and the Qataris, not arming the Syrian opposition. This is the main point. Just stop this pressure among these allies and everything will be okay. So it's not an involving of the American in NATO. And this is part of the American approach for what's happening in Syria. And again, I have been heard that from many times from the American officials. What's happening now, it's the American agenda which has been put on the table in the first meeting of the Damascus Syria friends meeting first in Tunisia before about 1 year. I have been there. Mr. Friedrichhoff was taking care of that file at that time. What's happening now? This kind of settlement have been put by the American. Simply, it's a settlement which gives the chance for the regime to continue. It's not a full fall of the regime like what's happening in Libya, for example. It's part, like let's say, of the Yemeni scenario, which allowed the regime to still exist under the execute that we don't want the state to be demolished. It means we have to preserve that institution, including the security and the military institution, which actually the main player with the Assad. You know, this institution, military and the security, is doing what it's doing there now. And it's since 50 years, it's almost a sectarian Alawite institution. 90% of the army officers, for example, is an Alawite officer. This demography has been changed during the last 5 decades. Also in the security department, which actually is controlling everything in Syria, all the details in Syria. So the main problem, they don't want the collapse of this regime in a military way or in a sudden way. And I think what's happening lately, that the American became more close for the Russian. The main detail about that there is a rule for Bashar Assad himself, not the regime, the other elements of the regime in the future. That was the main question. I think the American now said, like the Russian said, okay, let's let the answer for that question for the end of any kind of talk. But this kind of talk, actually, it don't depend and don't take into consideration what have been happening since 2 years. Maybe this what's happening now is offering. Maybe will be before 1 year or 15 months will be successful, but not now.
I don't think that, obviously intervention doesn't necessarily have to be, military Iraq style, and I don't think that's on the table. I do think that the United States is going to become more actively involved in the Syrian problem. But I think any move is, to any shift in direction is going to be very slow. There is no interest. For example, I don't think that arming the FSA at this point is in the cards, because I keep seeing the same influential figures in the American establishment raising the same arguments against that were always raised. I think that Washington realizes it has to give the appearance of activity, but it's still feeling its way, and it's still uncertain how far it wants to go. And so therefore you'll see meetings, you'll see statements, you'll see increase in humanitarian contributions, but again, no real sense of a coherent policy at this point.
And Günther Seufert, this hesitance and this uncertainty is also fueled by the fear on the part of the Western nations of who will come, who will replace Assad. Isn't that the case?
I think this is the case, but I think what is on the beginning is that we see a failure in both the capability of Turkey and of the US really to orchestrate the opposition, but also to orchestrate the regional support for the opposition. Because, Turkey tried to shape the opposition, and later the Americans did it with the forming of the coalition, and Turkey with the forming of the Free Syrian Army. And we see that these both actors did not manage to really create unity between the opposition. That's the first thing. And the second thing, that due to the reluctance in the states, in the experience in the Middle East, and due to the pacifist mood of politics in Europe, the West did not make use of the most important instrument, namely to arm the groups they really support. And what we see that the different groups had been armed by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, via Turkey. And today we see a development that Turkey is closer to Qatar and a little bit more in distance to Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Arabic Emirates, who are more reluctant in arming more militant groups because they feel they may become a threat for themselves. And therefore, the original coalition between the support states of the opposition is in a way very fragile today.
You alluded to something that I think has been overlooked or forgotten. When Hosni Mubarak fell in Egypt, with the Obama administration, seeming a bit ambivalent about the thing, this really shocked the Saudi leadership, and this angered the Saudi leadership. Now, whether you think the Americans were wise or the Saudis were wise is irrelevant. The Saudis decided to pursue their own policy in the Middle East without necessarily consulting with Washington. And you saw this in Bahrain. You saw it in decisions didn't really flower, but to expand the Gulf Cooperation Council, to shore up the Jordanian monarchy, to, in effect, pursue a policy that was in their interest. And this is something that I think makes it more difficult for the Americans, or for that matter, anybody else, to organize a regional approach to this problem. They're different actors with very different views of the situation and prepared to do very different things, and who will accept very different governments. And these people are not going to be easily brought together in a policy that they haven't signed on 100%.
Fawaz, as a Syrian, if you look at the intervention on the part of the West in Libya, for instance, in Mali as well, and to see the lack of action in Syria, as a Syrian, do you feel cheated? Do you feel left alone, if you will, by the international community?
Actually, this is not my feeling only. It's the most of the Syrian. You can see the people who was chanting in the street. We have nobody except you, God. This is part of all the demonstration in Syria. This is the feeling since more than one year about that. There was a lot of hope for the West, especially the American and the European. And I remember in the third or fourth month of the revolution in July 2011, when the American and French and British ambassador have visited Hama, which there was a very huge demonstration there, and a very conservative city, and the regime allowed them to go there, while he was not allowing that for the other ambassadors to move in Syria, and all of them have been astonished that they have been welcomed with roses. This was very good signal, and I keep telling for our friends, European and the American, that it's a golden chance. Don't waste it for a new approach and a new kind of relation between start to support the right side, and in this case you can rational all the process, and you can be partner in the process in the future, so we can eliminate the extremists. Unfortunately, I think, and I keep telling that it was a big lose and a big fall, not for this slogans about freedom and liberty, etc. That it have been very, at least as a Syrian, we see that the international community is not taking care about that. It's taking care about about supporting this kind of regime in different way. You don't think that the people, like the American, think that the American or the European government is supporting the opposition. No. This is not true on the ground. Many people see that the American, for example, position is very close to the Russian opposition. So there is no big difference nowadays between the two sides. I think what's happening is losing and allowing for the extremists to be part of what's happening in Syria. Before 1 year, we don't have Jabhat Nusra on the ground at all. Before 7 or 8 months, Jabhat Nusra was very weak. Okay, before of that, what's the international community said? There was no excuse for not at least having a big and a real pressure and real messages for Bashar Assad and his regime that you have to stop that, otherwise we are going to act. Vice versa, they are sending the wrong message. We will not interfere, we will not have any kind of pressure. And this is the only thing which Bashar Assad is afraid. They asked Muammar Gaddafi, Abdurrahim Shalgham said that Muammar Gaddafi was afraid of one thing, not the God in the world, but the American. So he was always trying to satisfy them. And let me tell you that also Bashar Assad have something to afraid the American in the first step. And when the American keep telling this kind of message that we are not going to have any kind of pressure against the regime, this will give them comfortable and go on what is going on.
Yeah. Do you understand and explain, though, the explanation and the fears on the part of the West that they don't want to see Muslim fundamentalists, if you will, replace Assad in Syria?
They can't just sit down like me and giving the advices. They have to be part of this process, because this process is going on, and it's proved that it's a fail of the think tankers expecting and protecting what's going on Syria. Now it's yes, we will have more extremists. As much as this is going on, this kind of policy, including that meeting which is having on the table. Let's have a totally different approach. Be part of the change. Take the decision. This is for the West. Take the decision that this regime can't go on anymore. And when talking about the regime, not talking about not only Bashar Assad. Bashar Assad and all this institutes which have been built since 50 years to control everything in Syria. In another way, I'm not talking in the sectarian way, but there is control by the Alawis minority over the state. This is not a secret now, Bilhay. Let's push for democratic countries. Doesn't matter who is ruling, the Sunni or the other. Let's. This is the main problem. Be part of this change and be a partner of what's happening. Otherwise, the other guy is going to feel that vacuum.
No, the narrative's out of control. You know, we talk about the Americans this and the Americans that. The Americans are 300 to 350 million people. It's not just the Council of Foreign Relations and Kerry's staff. And the Americans, in a country where political opinion does count, see things like, well, we backed the opposition to Gaddafi, and then they stormed our consulate in Benghazi and killed our ambassador. They see Jabhat al-Nusra, what are we doing? Arming, a bunch of Islamic extremists. Then now you're seeing, even I've started noticing in some American newspapers, a revisionist opinion of the Assad regime, where we talk about how, well, for many years he provided security, and the Christians and the Alawites and the secular Sunnis were, creating an illusion of a Syria that never existed. And this is, and this happens when you have a White House that's not really certain it wants to go down this road and is not attempting to build a consensus or build a policy. And because of that, all that means if there is movement towards involvement in Syria, it will be incremental.
I think I liked it very much what you said, Fawaz, that it is said that Gaddafi is more furious about Americans than of God. And that shows us that I think in the countries of the Middle East, people don't have any idea how politics is working in Western countries. And the Western countries don't have any idea how politics is working in the countries they are going to intervene. And that's the reason why we have these bad lessons learned in Iraq, where the Americans, in a way, intervened and had not been able to build up a society or to build up a national sovereign and really making policies working in the way we expected. And given all these experiences and given the fact that America is held responsible for what is happening now in Iraq, for what is now happening in Afghanistan, that the Americans are not eager to repeat it, I think it's very clear. I think the central problem is the indecision of politics, because you said the Americans and the West has to realize that they are part of the game, that they have responsibility. They are already part of the game, because the West turned a blind eye on the arming of the opposition with light weapons via Turkey and financed by Qatar. But it did not go the whole way. And you know, we are a part of the matter, but we are an indecisive part of the matter. And now what happened is that exactly what we didn't want, that because we are turning a blind eye on arming, and we are not directing it towards the more moderate groups. These groups fall into the back, and the militant groups come to the foreground. And the most important thing is the indecision, because it might be that it would be the wisest decision not to intervene at all, and not to support in any way the militarization of the conflict, given the structure of the population in Syria, given the strength of the security apparatus in Syria and the strength of the Syrian army. And therefore, and given what we did not mention, or only very slightly, given the central role Syria plays in the competition between Russia and China and Iran on the one hand and the West on the other hand. And given all these circumstances, it might be the very false decision or wrong decision to allow any militarization of the conflict at the beginning.
And for Marcelo, part of the hesitation might also lie and be reasoned within the fact that even the moderate opposition forces within Syria have not presented themselves in a professional manner. You yourself resigned from the Syrian National Council because you said they are not unified and that personal rivalries dominate the group rather than focusing on what's really of importance, namely replacing Assad's. As long as these so-called moderate opposition forces do not unify, do you see any chances of anyone trying to support and intervene in Syria?
Actually, what's happening is happening regardless now it's over. It's not how to supply with light weapons or not supplying with the light weapons. What's going on is taking place, and it has its own power to support what's happening to go on. Yes, look, the moderate people among not only the opposition, because the real thing which is taking place, not the opposition like me or my friends on the coalition or the NC. This is the main things. Those people who is fighting on the ground and through the military way or in the peaceful way, those people exist inside. Those people we should focus on and try to support the real side. You told me how. Okay.
What is the real side? Who is the real side?
The moderate side, which I'm sure the intelligence of the German intelligence and CIA know them more than I do. So it's what's happening is going on. Be part of what's happening. Don't just step away and say we are not going to arm the opposition because there will be a civil war. Okay, we have been armed and there is already civil war. There is nothing new in this case. Let's try to avoid the bad consequences. So, yes, there is a real work to have been done by the opposition. But the opposition is classical opposition, particularly, it's a minor player among this big power which keep, like you said, there is no kind of consensus between this power, including this power is involved.
Robert Reid, this conflict has been going on since March 2011, more than 2 years now. If you were an advisor to President Barack Obama, what would you propose to him? How to end this?
Power power of prayer, I suppose. I think that, obviously all conflicts, or at least most conflicts, end in politics at the end of the day, even the Second World War. I think that if the Russians are willing to, to work with the U.S. in some sort of fashion, that this framework ought to be proposed. But at the end of the day, most of the time that these things work, one or both of the parties wants out of the conflict and needs political cover. So they turn to the outside mediator, and the outside mediator arranges the talks and negotiations, and they end the war, allowing them to avoid the political risks that would come with appearing to surrender or whatever. I'm not sure that either party thinks they're there yet.
Günther Seufert?
Even more pessimistic, because we don't have in Syria only reliable, or what means reliable partners we are able to talk to. Maybe at one day we will be able to talk to Alawite statelet. Maybe at one day we will be able to talk to a Kurdish regional kind of administration. Maybe we will be able to talk to a kind of Sunni region, but we will always have these other actors, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and how to deal with them. It's not possible to deal with them in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And therefore, I'm very pessimistic. And I see only the thing that we have to pacify more and more regions in the country, and then look on what's happening.
Well, I think it's become blatantly obvious there are no easy solutions to this conflict, which has been raging and going on for over 2 years. I want to thank my guests for their contribution, and I want to thank you out there for tuning in. Looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.